Okay, so this is perhaps a bad advertisement because we are not going to talk about atmospheric rivers per se, but the reason I wanted it in this particular session is that I originally started thinking about this particular problem motivated by atmospheric rivers in 1992 from Reggie Muir's paper. So that's sort of the connection. Let's move forward. This work's being done by Jenny Nakamura for her PhD, and Jochen Kushner and Andy Robertson are the co-authors. So what I'm going to do is I'll show you something I've shown a few times at AGU, which is some ability to do season ahead predictions of annual maximum floods at unregulated rivers. So this is just a quick recap to perhaps show you that atmospheric rivers in the West actually translate into predictability in a sense. But what I'll not do is show you a lot of work we have done in other regions which leads to this, but I'll jump to the Atlantic because it's not exactly an atmospheric river story, as I said, but it's a story which shows dramatic predictability in terms of organized flows leading to floods. And so that's what we'll try to focus on here. And what I'm going to do is, what we've done is that we have looked at floods that have occurred in a variety of places in the US, all across actually, but we focus only on Midwest, Southeast and Northeast primarily. And each of these are derived from a USGS CDN database extended to come to the current time, which is for rivers where the floods are supposed to be unregulated and not affected by humans. And we have identified the 10-year flood in each case, in each river, and then we have looked to see for that flood what the conditions were in terms of delivery. And that's sort of the story that we'll build up. So I'll show you some example events very quickly, then I'll show you that once you composite over 17 different events in the Ohio River Basin, you still maintain amazing predictability in the March, April, May sort of time frame, and that's sort of the story that we want to build up. So this is the story of the West, and what I've shown here in the past is that this was done by a high school student actually, the early 2001 sort of time frame, and she did this for an Intel Science Talent project and won, so that was good. So what she did is that she looked at each of these states and identified a bunch of stations which were clean, and she picked the 10 largest floods which were common to all those stations, so there was a regional sort of attribute, the 10 smallest floods, and work up and down the coast. And then she did various composites. So what are shown here are SSTs for the season of the flood. Okay? And what you see is a symmetric distribution that when you have large floods in Washington, you have low floods in Southern California and vice versa on the other side. And then if you actually look through the trajectory parcels and so on, you see that the hotspots in this particular case here, and in that case shifted over here, they translate into the moisture trajectories that correspond to those flood events. So that's sort of the thing. So this other student looked at clustering these things based on seasonality as a surrogate for mechanism, and then he used basically just 4 predictors in a simple nonlinear regression, Nino 3, PDO for the previous season, and the trends of Nino 3 and PDO for the previous season. And the numbers in the boxes here are the unexplained variance for cross-validated forecasts, which was amazing. We have never actually published this except in his PhD dissertation, which is from 2005, because I can't still believe that you can get results that good. And this is, across all the 124 stations, box plots of the unexplained variance. So it looks pretty good, but at some point, maybe we should publish it. So if we come out and look at, other places, so the purples in the figures that you'll see are the location of the flooding. The arrows are the moisture transport, and the blue or orange-red contours are the convergence divergence. So blue is convergence. So in this particular event in 1950, from reanalysis we see that this is a 10-year flood or larger, and you see that moisture transport comes in the following way, and the station is located here. Here's the station shifted somewhat northeast of that one, and you see again there's a moisture source that converges to the right of a divergence zone and then converges to there and have a flood. Now we are back in Oklahoma, Texas, and you see a similar story. And now we are in the 1993 flood season, and we are somewhere up in the Midwest, and you see the thing a week later, the story is in the upper Midwest. So the main feature in all of these that you notice is meridional transport coming out of the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico and leading to these things. So we take a particular 10-year flood event now, And this is May 4, 1996. And we look at the average picture across various attributes from -5 to 0 days of the flood. You see the same sort of structure emerging here. You see that there is vertical velocity upwards in that particular zone. There's SLP structure such that this is going to go around. Actually, the SLP structure is right here. The Bermuda High is somewhat pronounced, and it goes around, and that's where the precipitation occurs. So this is one event averaged over 5 days. Now we get braver, and we take 17 events that occur in that region and a variety of streams, and we average across them. So now these are all different dates, all different years, and they're averaged across. And what you see is that the fundamental sort of picture we saw in the previous one across all of these pictures is preserved, which is kind of remarkable. And then we'll now go day by day. So this is day -10. Again, that feature of vertical velocity over there, the feature of the Bermuda High, you'll see that they will never move in this process. You'll see movement in the SLP, you'll see some movement in the 700 millibar high, and you'll see movement in the precipitation and movement in the moisture transport. So this is day -10, -9, slight changes, 8, 7, 6, 5. First burst of precipitation shows up, and there's convergence right there. And then as you move on through, there's disappearance, reappearance, intensification, day of flood, day -1 of flood, day of flood, precip is starting to vanish, thing is completely gone on the next day because the system has moved over. We've done a number of analyses like these in different parts of the country, 6 different regions, and we see similar features associated with these. The standard deviation associated with the moisture transport in the typical boxes that organize here is +3 to +5. Associated with that particular box's typical distribution. So the main thing I wanted to convey was, at this point we haven't done a statistical forecast comprehensively across the whole thing, but we are looking at the inverse problem of starting with where the floods are, identifying where the moisture transport is, identifying the SST structure, that we get coherent patterns across the board. So this is a pretty remarkable story, and we hope that what we can do with this, okay, this is a confirmation of the story, so we'll just move here. What we hope we can do with all this is that we can end up doing 2 major things. One is seasonal forecasts, or even 5 to 10 day forecasts based on pattern identification, which are more robust than what you get with WRF, because we have looked at WRF simulations this far ahead, and we do not pick up these features robustly. So that's the issue there. And what we also think we can do here is that when you look at climate change simulations, and what we find in most of the GCMs that we have looked at is that there are significant biases at a very basic level. So the equator to pole temperature gradient, land ocean temperature contrast themselves are so far off, and it is difficult to correct the biases in the joint distribution of those two, such that where the moisture transport shows up is surprisingly bad. Just because of that. It's not even because of where the convection is, where the clouds are, but the basic structure of circulation. So if we can identify, but what we do find is that if you address the biases in those two jointly, then the spatial pattern of precipitation sometimes snaps into place very quickly. So the models are not bad in that sense, they just don't get the overall structure right. So the hope here is that if we can do the pattern identification in the spirit of atmospheric rivers, which is the theme of this particular session, and the controls associated with this, that may allow us to look at climate change simulations also in a new light, and then come up with an approach for doing something. So I have done this rapidly with the idea that I can stimulate questions and comments rather than ground you with information, so I'll stop right here. Questions? In general, is that in a particular season, I'm not going to talk about pre-season yet, but in a particular season, you end up with locations of convection that are robustly persistent for quite a while. Okay? So they become moisture sources. In the Pacific, these manifest as Rossby wave transport. In the case of the Atlantic, they manifest as essentially transport around the Bermuda High, particularly if there is a block there, and the Bermuda High, if there's a block somewhere in the continent and the Bermuda High is extended, then the zone between the block and the Bermuda High becomes a focal point. So you get moisture transport through there. If I look at it as a forward problem, it's difficult because you end up spraying in different places. So it's like having a fire hose and you're just spraying it out. But if you look at the inverse problem, then the source of moisture is typically very robust. There's only one or two places where the floods come from for a particular geography. So what we are still working on is trying to understand what are the circulation controls which lead to persistent local convergence in a region, and then the disappearance of that convergence or the displacement of that convergence. If we get those two things working, we think we can understand what's going on.
You were showing convergence and moisture fluxes in one plot, and I was just wondering if it's maybe also a good diagnostic to look at moisture flux convergence.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. So the convergence that is there is moisture convergence.
Okay.
I'll just comment on the sequence you showed for the Midwest floods. It seemed that at each time period there were winds at least coming out of the tropics.
Correct.
And feeding into the moisture transport.
Correct. It's actually all the way to the eastern edge of the Atlantic where this thing starts, but it intensifies in the Gulf, typically. There are other cases where you get onshore flows on the northeast, and then in those cases the Bermuda High is actually displaced or shrunk a little bit, so the focus becomes that.
Well, there was a major event in Tennessee this last May, a very tragic flood. There was a remarkable sequence of satellite images from the SSMI of integrated water vapor. And in that particular case, there's a suggestion that even the ITCZ in the Eastern Pacific contributed some moisture into the root of that event. Do you see evidence of that?
We have seen those. So if you come down to the Texas, Oklahoma area and as you start, so actually if you go into the upper Midwest, and to the eastern side of the upper Midwest, then it's pretty much Atlantic. But as you come down, Florida, southeast, and so on, that's where you get the two sources. You get the eastern tropical Pacific source, and you get the Atlantic source. And in many cases, the Atlantic source there is not coming from the eastern Atlantic, but a direct straight meridian flow.
Any other questions?